Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In this third session, we turn our gaze beyond Europe to the Indo-Pacific. My name is Mikael Matlin. I'm a research professor at FIA and also the head of our recently established Center on Global Orders and China. I will be moderating this panel. We used to talk about the Asia-Pacific, whereas we now refer to the Indo-Pacific. It's an interesting question, it's all right, when, why, and whom pushed through this conceptual transformation and what it entails. In what ways is the new concept useful, and when might it be less useful? Perhaps some of our panelists would later wish to comment also on that question. In this panel, we will be covering wide ground, obviously the war in Ukraine and the challenge posed not only by Russia, but also by China to the rules-based order. We will talk about the role of other major actors in the Global South, particularly India, about heightened regional tensions and concerns revolving around Taiwan, North Korea, and South China Sea, about European and North Atlantic structures in the Indo-Pacific, and finally also, if we have time, a bit about deterrence and reassurance in the dynamic between the United States and China. We have here an impressive lineup of panelists, quite a large panel. I will briefly introduce the panelists. You have their CVs, so I won't be going through all of them. Just suffice to say that all of them are quite experienced in their respective fields. We have, starting here, closest to me, Andrew Michta, who is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative in the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. His areas of expertise are international security, NATO, and European politics and security, with a special focus on Central Europe and Baltic states. On his left side, we have Jessica Berlin. She's a German-American political analyst, founder of the strategy consultancy Co-Struct, and vice chairman of the board of directors at the Pan-African fintech company Bridge Technologies. She has previously lived and worked all around the world, from Afghanistan to Myanmar and Rwanda. Then we have in the center Barry Powell, who's the vice president and director of the RAND, National Security Research Division, at the RAND Corporation. He also directs the National Defense Research Institute. Then we have Lynn Kwok, who is Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. On her left, we have Umu Salma Baba, who is professor and Chamonix Chair at the Center for European Studies, School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And finally, we have Ewan Graham, who recently joined the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And before joining ASPI, Ewan was based in Singapore at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Let's start with a round of warm-up questions. Andrew, since Russia's war in Ukraine, several East Asian countries have become more enmeshed in European security matters, from providing aid to Ukraine and increasing arms sales to Poland, to China's participation in efforts to end the war. How do you assess the long-term implications of these moves for European security?
Thank you for inviting me, and this is really one of the key questions, because I would argue that unlike our debate in the United States about whether or not we should focus on Asia or on Europe, and also in Europe, quite often the Indo-Pacific kind of functions in the background. It's not seen as integral to the problem set. I think the Asians have a much more keen understanding that China may not be geographically proximate to Europe, but that it is a power in Europe and it's shaping this environment. So that's the first point. The second point is they seem to understand to a large extent that these two theaters are part of the same problem set, that this is not an either-or proposition, that what happens in the European theater will impact what happens in the Indo-Pacific theater. I think we sometimes lose this in our own debates here in the West. I think the fact that the Japanese are interested in having a liaison office with NATO, that the South Koreans have stepped in with weapons sales co-production without really much concern over how this may be seen in Russia. I think this underscores their sense that If the United States and its NATO allies lose credibility here in the Indo-Pacific, it will dramatically impact the security environment in Asia. And the last point I'd like to make here is that while you have all sorts of interlocking bureaucratized organizations in the Atlantic area, the security system Asia is much more based on bilateral guarantees, much more competitive, much more traditional balance of power setup. I think that's one of the reasons why they have a much more keen sense of threat. And I would argue, unlike in Europe, where there are still divisions about what threat Russia really poses, it depends on where you're located on the map here. You know, on the flank, like in Finland, there's a very keen sense of threat. That consensus on the nature of the threat is not as strong as you move away from the flank. I think in Asia, that threat perception vis-a-vis China and Russia is much more uniform. There's much more keenly seen. So I would stop here.
Thank you. So yeah, so the Indo-Pacific theater and the European theater are interlinked, and you only need to look at military expenditure, for example, in the area in East Asia, and you see that there is definitely concern for security among a number of countries. Let's move on to Salma. A colleague of mine recently stated that there is no such thing as the Global South. What is your view? Does the Global South exist as a political force in world politics? And if it does, how does it show now following the war in Ukraine?
So good morning, and thank you to HSF for having me here from India. I think the India voice needs to come onto the European platform a lot more. Hashtag Global South is not just a media invention, I think. It has been around for a long time, and I think it represents the collective voice, aspirations, ambitions, concerns of the countries located in the globally divided, the North and South kind of a spectrum. I think it's also important to recognize that in the kind of binaries which are being constructed now, when you argue that, as it was done in the morning just now, about Western countries, Western wars, and just causes, I think you end up doing a big disservice to the way you present causes and how you could bring countries together to work for what really requires for the planet to move forward. So I think in that extent, the Global South is not something which you can dismiss as two letters or two alphabets in different parts of the dictionary put together. But I think it's really a concerted effort at how would you collectively address what concerns everybody, in terms of global governance issues. If you're looking at a pushback coming from the Global South in the context of the recent BRICS expansion and what it stands for, I think it's also indicative of how power is shifting, both in terms of influence, scope, and action, and capabilities, when countries put their mind together to come together as a group, across the table. Whether you want to cooperate, negotiate, or move forward, you can't but escape that the Global South is here to stay.
Indeed, if you look at long-term trends, economic trends, for example, it all points to sort of the Global South just becoming stronger, actually, in relative terms. And we have seen that with regard to the Ukraine war, definitely there is a range of different stances and opinions in the Global South. Let's jump back to Europe for a moment again. Jessica, Germany has maintained strong economic ties to China, while leading politicians like Foreign Minister Baerbock have taken a more critical view on the risks in the economic relationship. Has Germany learned its lessons from its ill-fated energy dependence on Russia?
That's a really important question, and it's best answered with a marvelous German word, Jein. Ja und nein, yes and no. So on the positive side, yes, because when you consider the abject denialism that hallmarked Germany's approach to Russia in the lead up to the full-scale invasion, up until tanks rolling across the border and bombs falling on Kyiv, our government did not want to believe that this was possible. Whereas with China now, as has been demonstrated in the so-called China strategy that was just released by the German Foreign Ministry a couple of months ago, there's a clear recognition of China posing not only an economic competitive threat, but also a clear security threat to European and German interests. So that's progress. I won't delve too much into the particulars of the strategy paper, as they call it. It's not really a strategy. It lays out concerns and recognizes and acknowledges them. And for German standards, this is truly progress compared to what we saw with Russia. However, 2 points that make the answer also a no. There is no real plan. There's no real path to implementation, and for all the language that's in there, there has been a lot of pushback from the SPD, from the Chancellery, to actually implement and follow through on the recognition of the threats. And this was, of course, highlighted last fall when Scholz, the Chancellery, basically unilaterally pushed through allowing the Chinese state-owned enterprise COSCO to buy a minority stake in the port of Hamburg, which is, of course, Chancellor Scholz's old stomping grounds. He used to be the mayor of Hamburg. And this sort of willful blindness to the long-term threat of such short-term business deals, short-term investments, is deeply concerning. He made this move even in opposition to our own security services saying not to do it, not to mention all of our allies and his own ministers in the coalition government. So it's a strong yin. We do recognize the threat more, but it's not clear at all that that recognition will be backed up by serious, timely action in the years to come, because Germany is much more dependent on China than we ever were on Russia. They are our #1 trading partner. It's not just about energy. It's 5,000 German companies. It's billions in trade, in jobs. So our ability to disconnect from Russian gas was impressive, and for German standards, again, that was a really strong move last year. But we would not be able to do that across the entire economy, and there would be too many vested interests blocking against it. That being said, it's also not just a German problem. I think we have to recognize across Europe, across NATO, that we do not understand the Chinese and their intentions and their manner of playing power politics. We understand them even less than we understood the Russians. And for that, we thought we knew Russia well. You know, oh, the Russians are pissed about 1989. The Chinese are pissed about the Boxer Rebellion in 1901. You know, this is their geopolitical strategy, their view of themselves in the world, and what their goals are, go much deeper, and their planning capabilities and horizons go much longer term than even we anticipated with Russia for all of our Russlandversteher in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. So there has been progress, but the ability to follow through, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, it's a far more complex situation with dependencies on China, and this applies, of course, to many other countries as well, but perhaps particularly acute in Europe in the case of Germany. Ewan, the Ukraine war has heightened concerns also regarding a potential future military contingency over Taiwan. Is the Taiwan issue returning into a regional security issue? Sort of beyond traditionally being mostly a concern for the United States and perhaps a bit for Japan as well. And if so, what does that imply for us?
Thanks, Mikhail. Thank you also to the Finnish Institute for International Affairs for their hospitality. It's been great and a real pleasure to be here. I want to go back initially to your challenge in your opening about the origins of the Indo-Pacific by just briefly outlining, for those in the audience who are not aware, the first country officially to use the Indo-Pacific nomenclature was not the United States, it was not even Japan, it was Australia in the 2013 Defence White Paper. It's interesting because Australia had also played a large part in the previous formation, which I think was more familiar, still is, maybe in Europe, of the Asia-Pacific. Yeah. Why did they do that? I think the underlying geopolitical logic was about stretching the canvas of the region further west and bringing India in as a kind of counterbalancing factor. That was I think the real politic behind it. But it does show that even a small to medium-sized country like Australia can have agency on the wider issues, and I think that there's a general lesson in that. On your question on Taiwan, it's very much flavor of the month. I think, seen from a European perspective, there may be a risk of overstating the relationship between Ukraine contingency and a Taiwan contingency. On first principles, Taiwan is a regional security concern and has been since the 1950s. Why is it rising up the agenda? It's not because of what's happened here. It's because of the military build-up referenced in such detail by H.R. McMaster in the previous session, and also the intention to engage in a sliding upward scale of military harassment of Taiwan. I don't think there is however, I think there is a relationship between Ukraine and Taiwan, but it's not a hydraulic relationship. The calculus for whether Xi Jinping decides to use force in a Taiwan scenario will be done on a political calculation with military factors feeding into it, and it'll be done largely independent, I think, of the situation in Ukraine. However, if Vladimir Putin had a quick victory in Ukraine, that I think would have played an unhelpful accelerant in Chinese planning, viewed in a geopolitical risk calculation that's framed globally. Rationally, if the Chinese have taken any lessons out of the last year and a half, it's obviously that it's more difficult than it looks, even if you've only got a land border to go over. If you're attempting to do something as operationally complex as an amphibious invasion of an island nation, then clearly it's a much more difficult undertaking. However, I do think there is a general relationship in that it's woken up the region to the idea that major war is still around. It hasn't been banished from international relations. Therefore, there is a clear lesson. From the viewpoint of the rest of the region, I think the lesson of Ukraine is going to be that much more intense for Taiwan, because there is no friendly neighbor, Poland, over the border. You will have to be ready on day one and fight with the magazine that you have from day one. So clearly that's going to shift the calculus of defense and deterrence from the Taiwanese side, but also those countries in the region that are likely to be assisting it, which would be the small group that you alluded to, the United States principally, Japan certainly, because it counts very directly to their security, possibly Australia. Among the European countries, it's not going to be a key military role. The UK might be the one partner that's called in.
Thank you. We'll get back to Taiwan in a moment again. Moving further south in the, here I say Asia-Pacific, maybe Indo-Pacific also. Lynn, disputes related to the South China Sea, they are certainly regional in nature. They have been a perennial source of tensions between China and the United States. Have these disputes been affected by the war in Ukraine, and if so, how?
Thank you, Mikael, and my thanks as well to the Finnish International Institute. It's great to be back in Helsinki. I appreciate the invitation. You mentioned that the South China Sea was a regional issue, and it certainly is. It affects perhaps all the countries in the Indo-Pacific, but I would also venture that it's a global issue in the sense that trade through the South China Sea is important, but also, you know, where you see the deterioration or the erosion of the rules-based order in one part of the world, you see it in other parts of the world as well. And this, in fact, is an argument that many European countries are making in respect of the war in Ukraine, and unfortunately, which hasn't received the degree of a great degree of acceptance throughout the Indo-Pacific. So some countries think that the war in Ukraine has only to do with Europe and has nothing to do with the Indo-Pacific. So I would be cautious about describing perhaps the South China Sea as solely a regional issue. Yeah. But on your question about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine affects the South China Sea and whether there are any implications for it, I think there are two implications. First, of course, we see the erosion of the rule of law, which will have implications for the South China Sea insofar as we are already seeing the rule of law there being challenged, not least by China's actions in the South China Sea. So we are seeing additional stresses in the South China Sea insofar as the rule of law is concerned. Second, I think less obviously, we might also have implications of Russia, Ukraine, and the South China Sea insofar as it reduces Russia's role as a leading arms supplier and developer of offshore energy resources in the South China Sea. And this, in turn, I think, risks diminishing the strategic as well as economic options that countries in the region have in terms of developing resources there. So we have countries like Vietnam as well as Indonesia, which have turned to Russian companies to jointly develop energy resources in the exclusive economic zones. And China in the past has been quite tolerant, I would say, or has at least turned a blind eye in terms of this partnership. And this is in contrast with, say, Vietnam seeking joint development with countries like the United States in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. But with Russia perhaps leaning more on China, given the war, this might change. And in May this year, we in fact saw a Chinese research ship along with 5 Chinese escort vessels operate in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, very close to Russian-operated, to gas blocks operated by Russian firms. But I think it's also important to highlight that beyond the South China Sea, as I alluded to earlier, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has broader strategic implications for the region. And although we've had countries like Japan and South Korea signal that they quite clearly understand that the two theaters are linked and what happens in Europe matters to Asia, I think this broad point is not so much, this point is less understood in the rest of the region. Countries in the Indo-Pacific generally regard the Russian war in Ukraine as impacting food and energy supplies and prices, and for this reason are concerned, but they look less or see or acknowledge less the strategic implications of the war for the Asia-Pacific, and these are several. So of course we've already talked about how it erodes the rule of law, but also it causes greater instability for several reasons. First of all, it entrenches divisions along ideological lines. So Russia and China as one bloc, and the rest of the world or the West in the other bloc. And I don't think this entrenchment of blocs is a very helpful thing. I think we need to look at the specific issues and try to address them rather than paint the world in broad brushes or put countries in 2 blocks. Second, I think it also introduces unnecessary complexity into partnerships. So for instance, Singapore and Vietnam were both identified in the US Indo-Pacific strategy as important strategic partners in the region and with whom the US wants to increase cooperation. But of course, neither Singapore nor Vietnam are liberal democracies, so also kind of highlighting the challenge of autocracies or the competition as between autocracies versus democracies is unhelpful. And finally, the war in Europe, I think, gives rise to questions about the extent to which Europe might be willing and able to support the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific. Prior to the war, I think we saw various European countries and the EU issue Indo-Pacific strategies, which demonstrated an awareness that what happened in Asia mattered for Europe. But with the war, that's thrown up into question. And I think for Asia, this could be very destabilizing, because one thing that Asia has sought to do to hedge in terms of great power competition has been to look towards middle powers as providing strategic options for them. And I think in this respect, Europe has come out top in annual polls of whom Asia would best like to partner with, apart from if not for the US or China. And I think Europe also offers up an important middle path between outright confrontation with China and, on the one hand, and an approach which unduly acquiesces in China's unlawful and coercive actions.
Yeah. Thank you. You made a very important point here that this Russian aggression in Ukraine is in many ways also something that affects the global order. If you erode a rules-based order in one area, it has an impact. But you also mentioned the South China Sea. In the region where you're based, I mean, it's not necessarily so that everybody sees it that way. And it seems that if we frame it in the way of autocracies, authoritarian states versus democracies, then that is not necessarily always helpful in getting everybody on board on that issue. Finally, we turn to Barry. NATO has traditionally been focused on European security and transatlantic, of course, whereas the United States has maintained what has been referred to in the past as a hub-and-spoke system of military and security alliances in Asia. Is there any future role for NATO as an organization in the Pacific? How do you see this?
Sure, thanks. And I also thank the forum organizers for this conference, which I've already learned a lot from, and appreciate being invited. I think the short answer to your question is there will be a NATO role. I wish it were not the case. There's sort of specific scenarios where I see a NATO role pretty clearly, and there's also sort of general trends that I think are structural, but and they may even be inexorable. You know, the specific scenario is sort of imagine there is a China-Taiwan conflict. And hostilities have begun, you know, and there's going to be significant losses on all sides. And so if American forces are dying in the hundreds, you know, or even thousands a day, and NATO is not playing any role, you know, even a small but important military role, I think that's the end of the NATO alliance. I mean, there's not a chance that the American public, you know, would continue to support NATO. But even more so, I mean, a China-Taiwan conflict would directly affect the global economy, directly affect the European economy. And I think our bureaucracies like to play these games of siloing threats. You know, this is only for this threat, this is only for this challenge. But the structural trends that I think we're all kind of talking about, and at each conference, you know, during the course of the year, they seem to get clearer and clearer, is that, you know, the Eurasian continent is now one arena. You know, the interests of the allies of NATO, European NATO, North American NATO, and allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are converging pretty clearly, and I would even argue pretty quickly, you know, accelerated, I think, as someone said, by the Ukraine conflict. And then you're seeing China and Russia and North Korea also getting closer. I wish they had, you know, summit statements after their meetings. We don't know what they agreed to, but it just seems pretty clear that what Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin kind of started on February 4th of 2022, strategic partnership without limits, you know, that is continuing. And North Korea is now part of it. Some might argue Iran is now increasingly part of it. But so they're allies, but we don't treat them as if they are working together. And so I don't want to be a doomsday downer here, but what we really should be thinking about in terms of defense planning and foreign policy is, you know, these countries working together. So if China attacked Taiwan, do we think Russia and North Korea would just kind of hang out and watch? I mean, there would, you know, there is a plausible scenario, a set of scenarios where North Korea decides this is a good time to take action. Russia plays some role, depending obviously on its continuing invasion of Ukraine and that status. So I think we're really talking about like deterring World War III. We should just kind of, you know, if we're conservative planners, that's something that should be kind of a case that we think about. It's very daunting. It's horrible. We want to try to avoid it. We're spending a lot of our time trying to avoid it. But I think we should be just much clearer. When Xi Jinping was in Moscow for a state dinner and went to his car and Putin was saying goodbye, Xi Jinping turned back to Vladimir Putin and he said, if we work together closely, we can shape the next 100 years of global history. You know, so just think about that statement. And I'm not sure we're thinking as ambitiously and as holistically as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are. So I think if, as Andrew kind of intimated, if Putin is decisively defeated in Ukraine, that will damage China, that will damage Xi Jinping greatly. We should use that as an historic moment to also try to reset structures, arrangements, lock in the unity across the three continents that we've enjoyed during the course of the Ukraine war. So let's be creative, especially those of us not in government. We should be helping you in government with creative ideas. A few of them, a NATO-China Council. China will say no, but NATO and China should talk. We should lock in a Taiwan contact group and a Ukraine contact group and work together, the Japanese and others, Poland, and working with others. There should be consultations every 6 months or a year between like-minded allies, and including India, I think, where it makes a lot of sense. So I just think we should be thinking as ambitiously if we continue or strengthen our support for Ukraine to decisively defeat Putin. We need to be thinking creatively about how do we then reset to deal with this increasingly concerning set of actors that are working, unfortunately, closer and closer together. So that's why I think NATO will have a role in the Pacific.
So just 30 minutes into the panel, we're already talking World War III. It's a bit disconcerting. Let me challenge you a little bit on that point, though, and broaden or open up the discussion for the others as well. So, I mean, certainly Russia and China are both in their own ways currently dissatisfied with the Western-dominated order. But the ways of showing this dissatisfaction seems to also differ from each other. So how much daylight is there between Russia's overt challenge to the rules-based order and China's increasingly active attempts to put its mark on the global order? Is it really, as you were seemingly alluding to, a united autocratic front that includes also, for example, North Korea and Iran potentially?
Well, I think deep Russia experts and deep China experts will say they will never be close, they will never be allies. But 40 meetings and birthday cakes between the two leaders, there could be a pretty good run here of a number of years, including more than a decade with these two autocratic leaders in power. So, that said, the academic point made, I think there can be a lot of cooperation. And so, are their interests 100% aligned? No. Can they act as allies to help each other advance their perceived interests? Yes, very much, and we're already seeing, quite a bit of that. And so China's style is to use the many, many tools that it has at its disposal, economic, but also, economic in terms of trade, but also coercion. There have been dozens of instances of Chinese coercion over the last, 10, 20 years, and I think the West should get together and develop contingency plans for when China takes economic coercive action X, here's how we work together. If China bans, seafood from Japan, here's the allies that will work together. If China bans Norway because of Nobel Prize, here's how the allies work together. We should be treating the economic and technology domains with the same types of approaches and methodologies in this era as we did for the military in the previous era, as one example. But China has disinformation tools, trade, culture, cash, intelligence operations. So they have a wide range of tools. Russia has very few. Energy, nuclear weapons, conventional military, and intelligence, and cyber. So I think the bottom line is, we should believe Xi and Putin when they say, we have a strategic partnership without limits, and I think they're demonstrating it in practice.
To just chime in on that, 2 points. So one of the fundamental weaknesses in the Western response to both Russian and Chinese aggression is that our planning horizons are based off of our electoral cycles. We have very short-term planning. We have very short-term goldfish memories and reactive times, whereas autocracies in general, and Russia and China in particular, they are able to plan and implement for generations. And they do. And our failure to recognize this and to plan accordingly fundamentally undermines our ability to react to the threats they pose. That's the bad news. The good news is we can and should, as Barry mentioned, we can try to circumvent this on our side by strengthening our institutional frameworks that can supersede our individual national election cycles and hiccups, and whether it's something as small as a trade issue or as large as a Trump in the White House again, by strengthening our multilateral ties, we can create a framework where we're able to still have plans in a space that is somewhat protected from the day-to-day ups and downs of national strategy and planning. The second important point is that in the Russia-China partnership without limits, there's only one partner in the driver's seat, and that is China. China does not see Russia as an equal. Never has, never will. And this war, Russia's disastrous war in Ukraine, has made that extremely clear to Beijing. So yes, Russia serves a purpose. Yes, Russia is useful. And the folks who at the beginning of the invasion were saying, oh, China's being so quiet on Russia. They're on the sidelines. We don't know what they're thinking. No, nonsense. China was always going to be on Russia's side on this. And they weren't saying anything because they didn't have to. It wasn't in their interest to speak up. They were watching and waiting, and they were watching us. They were watching to see how quickly we, in the Western world, NATO, reacted. And what they saw was too little, too late, slow, bickering, cowardly, and nearsightedness. So this gave them the motivation and the confidence to become more proactive in shaping the space, reaching out to Russia. But a decisive defeat of Russia in Ukraine, they need to be humiliated. And this will remove China's largest pawn on their Eurasian table from the board. So this has to be part of our strategy. We have to try to see China and Russia not as this rising tandem block, but weakening Russia as one of the quickest, surest, and most cost-effective ways of deterring Chinese aggression.
Yeah, just a couple of points. First, a more general one. It's kind of a plea to anybody in government or in the policy community or think tanks that we need to get away from simply talking in normative terms of rules-based order and value-based systems. Because in the international system, those orders are a function of power distribution, of regional balances. So I think if we start kind of going down deeper into this conversation, we'll achieve two things. In the US, our electorate will understand what we're talking about when we ask our citizens to support both Ukraine and our allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. So that's the first point. And I think in those categories, whether we call it alignment or alliance or similarity of views, there is a Sino-Russian axis in place. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Whatever drives them, to Jessica's point that the Russians are not really partners because of their power capacity and the rest. I agree with that. They're more vassalized than their actual partners. But they bring tremendous assets to the table that the Chinese do want. Some of it is high-end military technology that the Chinese want to get their hands on. It's built on the post-Soviet designs with the access to Western technologies, especially in hypersonics, especially in propulsions for submarines and other areas, where the Chinese are simply not there yet. Just because you manufacture a lot of stuff doesn't mean you can produce state-of-the-art weapon systems. So we do have a very dangerous alliance confronting us. I'll remind you that my country went to war twice in the 19th century to prevent one power from dominating the resources of Europe and Eurasia, because this would lock us into our hemisphere, would end our access, and endanger our prosperity, our security, and the rest of it. Then we fought a Cold War for half a century to prevent a former ally that was getting ready to do exactly that following the Second World War. So we're now looking at a situation now where we have not one power, but two powers trying to accomplish that. And I don't see enough urgency among our political leadership, especially in the West, to appreciate how profound this threat is. To your comment, well, World War III, in my mind, Putin declared something akin to that when he first spoke to his own people in 2005, and then at the Munich Security Conference, with Senator McCain. I remember looking at him, realizing what was being said. Russia is a quintessentially revisionist power. It wants to relitigate 1991. China is even a greater threat because it's an existential threat. It wants to not just address the power distribution, it also has a different set of ideological principles it wants to implement, the way it organizes the state. A colleague of mine once said, kind of glibly, but this is a really nice cliche now, Russia is a storm, China is a climate change. If they win, we will wake up in a world that has nothing to do with democratic principles, how we win, how we operate. So we need to communicate, I would argue, to our political leadership and also to our publics what is at stake and how profoundly dangerous this is. One last comment to Jessica's observation. China is actually very actively helping the Russians. It is doing so both in terms of purchasing a lot of Russian energy, 2022, 2.6 times increase in pipeline gas sales from Russia to China, LNG about 2.5 times, 20% more black coal purchases last year. A new pipeline is being built. And also in terms of components that the Russians need for their weapon systems. I mean, this is as tangible as it gets. Smuggling across Kazakhstan, all of that's happening is enabling the Russians. So there is a very clear alliance in security optics, and I think the Chinese are trying to exploit the opportunity this has created.
So in this geopolitical environment, India has also emerged as a key player that's pivotal for the maintenance of a rules-based order. How is the Indian government positioning itself in this larger scheme of things, and how do you personally think it ought to position itself?
So I think a lot of has been said on multi-alignment and, where does India stand? Let me make it clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the GOI. But if I look at it, I think a fundamental question to ask is, what is the nature of multilateralism today? Why is it between formal institutions and the expanding field of informal multilateral groupings? Something tells you about the disconnect of formal institutions and the embeddedness of what Andrew also mentioned, but I would look at it differently, about the positional power that existing institutions bestow to members. It is not dynamic enough to capture how the global economic pyramid is changing. Where does India position and stand itself? You can't engage just on the basis of your interest alignment. I think that's important to take in mind. I mean, it precludes and prevents the articulation of others' interest, and democracy cannot be a subset of hierarchies determined just by some democracies situated in the north. Or to say that the RBO and a liberal institutional order, I mean, I think you've got to unpack that. I mean, there is rules and there is an order. And who has created the rules and who is managing the order, I think clearly tells you about why India's own augmentation in terms of being an economic power will definitely transform this pyramid, point one. Second is, let's talk about the convening power, whether you want to talk about the convening power of the West, which is a part of their positional power within the existing institutional framework. And what happens when, as you pointed out to the earlier tagline, hashtag Global South, who talks about them, right? You can't pick and choose different rules to apply to different geographies of the world when it is convenient for you. I think that point in such a, media scrutinized and interdependent world is very clear. You are to try to create a firewall and say that what happens from our lens of understanding is the way that you have to understand it in different geographies is clearly not the way this narrative is running and playing out. And I think in that, India will use its positional status to engage the West. I don't think we have to explain our democracy just like others don't explain, because I don't think it's just about the electoral nature of a democracy. What you're looking at is what that means in ethos and principle to bring about a fundamental change in your political systems and the decision-making that you do. And I think India, in that sense, is a democracy, and no further stamping needs to be done. It's a work in progress. It's a work in progress here. You could talk about the democratic decline within the European Union and what is being done to stem that as you look at even expanding the European Union. So I think the important point from where India finds itself, is how much is it that the others want to engage with India and what India brings to the table, right? And we've seen a lot of that expand, especially in the context of the G20 now, the fact that everybody came on board to make a New Delhi declaration, the summit, that's an extremely important point. But I think India is also showing that it can effectively be that kind of an actor which can talk to both sides. I think in all of this, Jessica made a point about decisively and effectively defeating Russia. Let's not forget that even if you do that, history will be a reminder that you can't escape your geography if you don't engage your neighbor. And I think that is something that has to be kept in mind. You are tied to geography. You may have all the kind of resources where you would try to do that. But at the end of the day, at least, looking at what is happening here in Europe, you would have to engage Russia. There's no two ways about it. For India, we know that we have to engage China. From 2020, we've had a point where the escalation of conflict between India and China has gone up. And there is no Article 5, there is no Article 42.7. It's Indian boots on the ground. It's only Indian military which has effectively taken on the Chinese military. And we know where that leaves us. So I think India will be coming to the negotiating table or to the international table and fora, clearly with positioning its own interest, just like I think all the other countries do. And I think that will remain. You can't say it's a non-alignment 2.0, which somebody likes to talk about. I think that's over. But India recognizes that it would be an effective strategic partner to the countries which are able to, like-mindedly engage with India.
Just one point there.
Yes.
It kind of perplexes me how sometimes there are countries in my part of the world and elsewhere that talk about how they are entitled to take into account their own interests, and the other parts of the world cannot then dictate their interests. But in my view, I think an expansive view of national interests includes, so no one's saying you shouldn't take your own interests into account. Every country is going to take its own interests into account. And I don't think there was anything particularly wrong about Trump saying, America first, because would it be America last? That would make no sense, right? And I think every country puts their own national interests first. What is different, however, is how a country looks at its national interests and whether national interests are best supported by multilateral institutions and multilateral engagement, as well as support and defense of the rule of law. And I think what is problematic is increasingly countries are looking at what is in their national interest in a more and more narrow way, and therefore saying, we don't need to take sides in this argument, say in the case of Russia and Ukraine, because it's not really in our interest, etc. But really, I think that the rule of law is in every country's interest, and every country, in a sense, has that has talked. Like the UN Charter matters, invasion of a sovereign nation it flouts the UN Charter. So I mean, it's very perplexing for me how some countries appear to have adopted a very narrow approach to national interests.
On that topic, Ewan, Australia definitely has been quite clear, I think, on where its interests lie. How do you see Australia as being a very active power, middle-range power currently in the Indo-Pacific? We have seen, for example, the AUKUS trilateral mode of security cooperation recently.
So AUKUS was an interesting initiative, I think, in a basic sense, the fact that it was an initiative from, if you like, the old partners, the Anglo partners, the US, UK, and Australia, was a re-seizing of the initiative. I think that so long China, Russia had the initiative in being able to basically revise the order in ways that the partners were reacting to. This was a resetting of the agenda on the most ambitious of scales. But Australia was the instigator, if you like, of AUKUS, and it came out of a very desperate situation. It's really about redressing a balance of power which has got out of kilter in the Indo-Pacific. The origins of it was in the dysfunctionality of the Australian replacement for their current diesel submarine program. The last submarine was commissioned in 2003 at the earliest. The next submarine to be commissioned into Australian Naval Service will probably be in the early 2030s, a span of 3 decades. That's a pretty calamitous state of affairs, considering that submarines will form the backbone of long-range strike for Australia in future. AUKUS goes broader than that. It is a military capability initiative. It's also interesting that capability may be wagging the grand strategy dog in some senses with AUKUS. It's not just about the capability, it's also the signal that it sends, that at the core of this, the US-Australia alliance is really a kind of doubling down in military terms in a way that will have a generational impact because of the implications of the cooperation that's being undertaken, not just on nuclear propulsion, but on Pillar 2, all of the other technological strands. But I think fundamentally it was about counterbalancing. There are limits to it too, because we're not only in a discussion about military deterrence, and just to go back briefly to the Taiwan point, I think that the Taiwan, we do need to be seized of the risk of military aggression against Taiwan, but there's a lot that can happen between now and that point. We also need to be deterring China across the broader toolkit that was alluded to in earlier comments, that China has a much broader toolkit than Russia at its disposal, and has been revising the order more successfully, if you like, by salami slicing in other ways, using economic coercion, although I think it hit the limits of economic coercion in the Australian case. It's another way in which Australia maybe is a useful exemplar in a broader sense, because economic coercion was used by China but didn't really have a macroeconomic effect. Certain sectors were hit, but really Australia has weathered the storm, and weathered the storm by holding true to its political principles, refusing to trade off political demands from Beijing for economic incentives. And I hope that is the course that Canberra continues to steer, because really the lesson from that was that the market delivered. There were options for Australia to diversify and find other markets. And it gets to the point that was also made, that deterrence has to work on a much broader policy spectrum than just the military scenarios, but a kind of an analog to Article 5 that works in the economic space between the allies and partners is going to be a necessary part of the toolkit going forward.
Thank you. I think at this point we could open up the floor also for the audience to ask questions. So please raise your hand, and can I ask you to be relatively short and to the point if you have any questions. There, I see one hand. Please present yourself as well.
Good morning, excellent panel. My name is Janne Leino. I work for the Helsinki representation now in Brussels, but I used to be based for a German think tank in China for many years. And my question is, when traveling around Asia and speaking to defense ministries of different countries, most of them were looking more at regional powers at the moment, mostly at Japan, because as you know, Japan is redefining its self-defense posture. So my question is, how and what kind of role should Europe play in the regional cooperation mechanisms in the area? Thank you very much.
What power should Europe play? Then we have one more question from Kai Sauer.
Yes, Kai Sauer, chair of the FIA board, Finnish ambassador to Berlin. The UN has been quite marginalized in the question of Russia and Ukraine. And I would like to ask maybe the Indian representative, where do we stand now with India's pledge to become a permanent member of the Security Council? Has the debate on Ukraine and India's close proximity to the Russian and Chinese position advanced that goal? Thank you.
Thank you. We could take one more question, and then we have it there. Yes.
Jakob Algren, I'm director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. The Quad hasn't been mentioned in this debate, so I would like to ask you what role the Quad could have, given the title of the panel. Thank you.
Yep, the Quad should have been mentioned. Thank you. So who wants to go first? Ewan?
I can run with the Quad question.
Yeah, take it.
So I mentioned the Indo-Pacific at the beginning. I think the Indo-Pacific, if you like, is if that's the geospatial framing for the region, the Quad is the operating system, or the aspiration towards an operating system that has a counterbalancing logic, I think, fundamentally at its core. It is based on a common threat perception and also the location of those 4 countries, which spans the Indo-Pacific, really like compass points. That puts Southeast Asia in a somewhat difficult position because it's at the center, and it has its own vision for ASEAN centrality as the hub for the regional architecture. There's been a bit of a tussle, I think, in the purpose of the Quad, partly with that tension in mind, because the more that it's seen as a containment vessel for China, the more I think it's put ASEAN offside. In my view, there's been an overcompensation for that by steering the Quad away from a hard security agenda. Now it's in public goods almost exclusively when it meets. I think that was a mistake. I don't think it should be exclusively a defense and security forum, but defense and security is a perfectly legitimate part of its agenda, and it needs to be steered back to that, rather like the naval Malabar exercises, which hinted at that purpose. I think as a result of that, we've also seen energy going elsewhere to other minilateral initiatives, AUKUS being one case in point. It's not a competitor to AUKUS, but we've also seen the United States, I think, doubling down on its treaty alliances, partly perhaps with some disappointment in the Quad in mind. The trilateral recently between Japan, Australia and the United States being the latest data point, but the longer effort in the Japan, Australia, United States trilateral as well. Those are, if you like, the more functional building blocks. I think the Quad is worth keeping because it has that symmetry of serving the Indo-Pacific and acting as a counterbalancing point. I think India is also still, it's the odd one out in the sense that it's not a treaty ally of the United States. So there has to be a way of making it work for India's purposes as well. And buying into the concept that this is giving India a rule-setting role, I think, is an important unspoken part of what the Quad is. But ultimately, the challenge that we face is framed by counterbalancing the challenge posed primarily by China, but also in cohesion with Russia and North Korea, 3 contiguous nuclear powers in the Eurasian space. They don't have to trust each other as a necessary condition to cooperate and cause a great deal of disruption and revising of the status quo, which is their common denominator, the common denominator motivation. So I think the Quad is going to be a necessary part of the mix, but it's not going to do that through syringes or infrastructure development exclusively. It does need to embrace what it is, a counterbalancing concert of powers in the making.
Barry and then Andrew.
Yeah, just like 45 seconds. I mean, I think it's very interesting when the Quad, AUKUS, and the trilateral cooperation among Japan, Korea, and the United States. I mean, those are really interesting new. I mean, look at even 2 years ago. I mean, these structures didn't really exist, and so I think look at that kind of new set of foundational arrangements. There should be more coming, no doubt. I mean, I think these are things that can be built. I mean, to me, the U.S. has to come back to the multilateral economic playing field. That's a major missing piece. There was an attempt at the IPEF, but it's not really filled out. And then how do we make sure that that there's good crosstalk with Europe, either through the TTC or some other mechanism that I'm probably not thinking of, but others in the room can. So I just think, thinking about this in a medium to long-term framework where these are very good foundational pieces. Let's keep building and let's make sure there's connections to the European continent also.
Yeah, very quickly. So I'm in complete agreement with Barry's earlier comment that if there is a conflict, kinetic conflict in the Indo-Pacific, Europe has to be present in some shape or form. I think otherwise we will fracture the alliance, especially when it comes to the U.S. side. But let me redirect the question of what the Europeans can do, what Europe can do in the Indo-Pacific, to what you can do here at home. Europe needs to rearm. We need to transfer the burden of conventional deterrence and defense onto the European NATO allies. We will provide the high-end enablers, the nuclear umbrella, the rest of it, that's no question. But if you look at what the Ukrainian war showed, Europe has no capacity today to perform the kind of logistical mission that is absolutely necessary. Some major allies are disarmed to an extent that it will probably take a decade of serious commitment. How many, Bundeswehr's got about 250 tanks, Britain fewer than 200. Munition stocks are completely inadequate. The size of the militaries. That burden transferring frees the United States to be more responsive in the Indo-Pacific. It helps us in the Indo-Pacific. So what you do in Europe in terms of rebuilding the European component of NATO is absolutely essential.
Salma.
Yeah, so on the issue, thank you, Kai, for the question. India's position, UN Security Council, I think framing it in the way of there is a threshold for entry, and there's going to be a litmus test on how effectively you will forward pay something. That is not the way you look at what it is and the construction of the international institutions, in particularly the UN Security Council, which would primarily, the 5 permanent members have a higher sense of responsibility in terms of, if you read the charter, what they're supposed to do for global peace and security. Not wanting to reform the UN Security Council cannot be just based on what you do or don't do as a way of showing your intention to stand up into what you will perform in the future. I think that same test of litmus test of your performance ability to a rules-based order should also equally apply to the 5 existing members. And I think we will get a very, very different kind of an answer over there. Having said that, I think in India's case, and India's been pointed out repeatedly in the last 1 year since the war broke out in Ukraine, on undertaking extra purchases of oil. And I think the record speaks for itself in terms of everybody in this room looking at what has been Europe's own position in engaging with Russia. And I don't mean just now, after 2014, but I think it requires a better understanding. And let's not assume that the rest of the world or the global south is not looking at that. 2008, the war in Georgia, 2014, to what happened in Crimea, the European collective response, if you want to put it that way. I think these are everything which everybody around in the global south is watching. To assume that a narrative just can be constructed from 24th of February of last year, I don't think cuts the ice. I think it's important to recognize where countries individually here within the European Union have engaged, the European sanctions in the way, creating a firewall of convenience to keep purchasing oil and gas, till they find alternatives. I think all speaks volumes about how you engage with the idea of responsibility, global institutions, and rules-based orders. And I think in that context, India has shown, and India has stated, my colleague here pointed out that a narrow self-definition of interest. I would like to point out that when you do not have any institutional arrangements, as we do in our part of the world for security, then I think you have to be looking at not as narrow, but how do you look at what you're going to preserve. And just a concluding point, since we're running short on time, I mean, the initial arguments on presenting the war as a binary narrative between autocracies and democracy versus an autocracy did not, service at all to the fact that what is at stake is about international law and territorial sovereignty. I think that was not really what was brought out. It was brought up, you line up on the sides of democracies. I think if that is the narrative you're going to be constantly putting out, you are going to lose in the sense of who will stand with you. Are we talking about laws and international laws which are sacrosanct? then the conversation can head in a different direction. Let's not pit this argument into a binary of this is a good war, a just war, and a bad war. You can find a whole lexicon of that in terms of where countries around the table of the UN Security Council, the permanent five, have been on these kind of wars, right? And if this is about building a different thing, if we are all challenged by the same problems of what climate change does and where we are going to meet our agenda on the SDGs, then I think we will have to, shift out of this binary and look at how do we build cooperation of a different kind. Otherwise, we could have a lot more conferences like this, and we would still, at the end of the day, go back thinking, okay, let's just do a democracy versus autocracy. I mean, there are going to be problems in existing democracies. Let's not forget about that. Like I said, it's a work in progress. But the point is to also look at how do you engage others, right? And in that, the Quad was pointed out, the Indo-Pacific is pointed out. These are new geographies and interconnected theaters, and I think we're going to be looking at how do we manage our differences, because I think, and this is my concluding point, ideational proximity does not lead automatically to a convergence of interest. We are still bound by what the geographies of distinction and the locations of neighborhoods provide.
I'll be very brief. I just want to add to something on the European point. Japan was mentioned. I just want to stress that my perception is that there is demand in the region for a European role. It may not necessarily be a European military role, but there is demand. The existence of this panel in itself is an encouraging sign that Europe is taking the Indo-Pacific seriously. Don't be browbeaten by Russia into focusing exclusively on European defense. That's playing the game of Russia and indirectly China too, which doesn't want to see Europe involved. I think just a plea to keep your minds open, your horizons broad and your eyes up, because there is more going on in the world, and there is a linkage hinged on the Sino-Russian relationship principally.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so I'll give the last words first to Lynn and then to Jessica.
Thank you. So to the point on Europe's role in the region, I think Europe's role is important for several reasons. First, it serves as a balancing power. Second, it's a balancing power that can also take the hard edge of US-China competition. And third, it offers, as I mentioned earlier, the region other strategic options, strategic and economic options. So that's broadly why it's important. In terms of what it can do, you mentioned that the region was looking very much at Japan, and indeed, Japan is listed as the second most desired partner after Europe in terms of hedging the region Southeast Asia's bet in the US-China rivalry. And that's because I think Japan is perceived as bringing to the region important strategic offerings. And although we hear very much about China's Belt and Road Initiative in this part of the world and in my part of the world as well, what sometimes goes under the radar is the extent to which Japan actually Japan's investment in infrastructure in the region far surpasses China to date, right? And so in terms of giving Europe clues in terms of what the region wants, we can look, for instance, in the case of Southeast Asia, at the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. It's quite a broad framing document, but it highlights, 4 main areas that it desires cooperation on, and one of them is, in the maritime domain, in terms of infrastructure development, as I mentioned earlier, digital connectivity. And I think Europe is also strongly placed to provide capacity building in terms of the promotion of the rule of law as well. And I think what has also gone under the radar is the extent to which we have China, although it's an autocracy, employing the tools of democracy. So, people say China flouts the rule of law. It doesn't disregard the law. It says it is very important. It says it's following the rule of law. So it's developing a legal arsenal to add to its tool set beyond military tools and economic tools, but also it has legal tools that it's developing to advance its strategic interests, not just in Asia, but in the rest of the world as well. And I think Europe should be cognizant to that fact and also develop its own tools, not so much just in terms of adhering to the rule of law, but also developing legal tools issues which will advance its strategic ends. And finally, I think what I touched on was mainly in the economic and legal diplomatic domain, but also, presence in the region militarily as well. Don't forget the region. It is important to have a presence there in terms of, say, supporting the open seas, etc. So I think that should not be forgotten in the wider Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Thank you. And then Jessica, please.
30 seconds to sum up. Lucky me. First point to the UN question. Whether India or Germany or anyone else joins the UN Security Council, the Security Council is broken. As long as we have these veto-holding members, and as long as veto-holding members can unilaterally obstruct the application of the rule of law and the following of the UN Charter, it's a moot point. I think the UN has reached its League of Nations moment in this war. Full stop.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for all of us? As this panel, as this entire conference, and as Russia's war in Ukraine have shown, this is already World War III in terms of its implications for world history and in terms of it being a breaking point in our institutional order that was created in the aftermath of World War II. Our world order, quote unquote, is 80 years old and it needs to be rebooted. Our conflicts and our cooperation, our problems and our potential are global. And we need a global system, a global alliance of democracies and aspirant democracies to solve the challenges of our time. And the UN is not fit for purpose to do this, to ensure peace and security, and to enable economic cooperation and collaboration on challenges such as climate change. So when we walk out of conferences like this, even as we consider the minutiae and the short and medium term issues that we need to solve now, we need to already be thinking about what is a viable, not perfect, nothing's going to be perfect, but what is a viable new institutional framework for the world order that builds off of what we have, what we inherited in the aftermath of World War II. It's 2023. We need a new way, and no one else is there to do the job for us. We need to have the vision. We need to have these conversations with our partners on all continents and make a system that will not be perfect, but will be better, and that is armed, that is applicable, and that can last until, no doubt, the next breaking point is reached in world history. But for our generation, for the generations represented in this room, that is the task. And there's no one else. It's on us.
On that very important point, we conclude this panel. Please join me in thanking the panelists.